Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Fincas Mierisch wash-processed Nicaragua from Swerl Coffee Roasters. There's the bag right there. And Swerl, based out of Falkenberg, Sweden. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on several occasions, including earlier this year when we reviewed the Gedebelesa, a wash-processed Ethiopian coffee. And a multi-roaster nearby has began carrying their coffees a bit more frequently. So as a result, I've had more opportunities to purchase their coffees, and this coffee immediately caught my interest for a couple of reasons. The first of which being that I do want to revisit this coffee roaster several more times before we do release our European coffee roaster tier list, as I'm somewhat in between a couple of spots on where I want to put them on that list. Another reason being that we don't review too many wash-processed Nicaraguan coffees throughout the year, so that also did catch my interest about this one. But the last reason being that this one had a very interesting candy cane note listed on it, and it's not a note that I've seen on too many coffees. In addition to that, given that it is the holiday season, it felt like a very fitting review. So it'll be interesting to see how this coffee turned out, as this right here is day 42. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee. So once again, Swerl's profile is very much what you might expect from that term Nordic light profile, as their coffees do definitely have that Nordic feel to them. They are still notably lighter than the vast majority of coffee roasters out there, though not to the same extent as those ultralight coffee roasters out there. So I feel like they fall into that more traditional line of light by most standards and metrics, though not necessarily overly light. Hopefully that gives you a good idea. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 16, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and the coffee was instantly offering a nicer level of contrasting sweetness and brightness than initially expected, as it definitely had a very traditional feel to it, and the mixture of the three definitely left a very interesting first impression, as there was possibly the priming effect in play, as the candy cane note made a lot of sense, as there felt like a fair bit of a chocolate peppermint tea-like feel to it. Additionally, some notable palm fruit brightness lending itself towards a pretty interesting first impression of this coffee. Day 19 through the Chemex, and the coffee is still surprisingly sweeter than expected, and that's what I continue to go back to on this one, is that it just turned out so much sweeter than I typically experience for washed Nicaraguan coffees. It had plenty of the traditionality to it, with more of that palm fruit brightness and a bit more of a robust characteristic this time around, as this one definitely had a fair bit of body and texture to it in general. Day 22 through the April brewer, and the coffee has taken a slight step back this time, as it's a little less sweet and intense, offering a more traditional approach to a Nicaraguan coffee with a slightly more robust feel. And they do have a tea note list on here that I feel like was at play notably frequently within this coffee, so this was okay overall. But given that the first couple of impressions of this coffee were extremely positive, it did take just a little bit of a step back. Day 25 through the V60 with Swerl's recipe, and Swerl's recipe is basically the same as ours, just lowering the temperature 2 degrees Celsius, and it is the best it's been to this point, as it does have plenty of that candied sweetness once again. Intensity is better overall, with a very lingering fruit finish to it. Uniqueness in that interesting minty candy sense, as the coffee has a really nice level of sweetness to it. And I feel like this wasn't necessarily the adjustments we had made, but rather this coffee just opening up with a little bit more time, as the intensity was just continuing to grow every time we brewed this coffee. Day 28 through the Chemex with Swerl's recipe, and the coffee was not quite as good today as it had been on some of the previous days, as the traditionality really seemed to be honed in a lot more on this day. Much more robust once again, as there's still plenty of the listed candy cane, as the coffee is presented in a slightly mint-like sense and a sweeter sense once again. So I think I should notate on here that relative to a lot of the coffees that we've had from Swerl, maybe this one felt a little bit more developed, but I think even then it's still pretty light for a Nicaraguan coffee. Can't remember too many Nicaraguan coffees that we've had turn out this light, but it could also be that this coffee just continuously felt so traditional the entirety of the time that we were consuming it. Day 31, back through the V60 with our standard recipe, and the coffee is back to its best, as it's offering a nice contrasting combination of the candied fruit as well as traditionality, with a combination of both sweetness and brightness, plenty of body and intensity, so a pretty nice day this time. Day Day 34 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it's back to having some of the issues with this brew method, as I really didn't like this coffee that much through the Chemex. It really seemed to be at its best with the V60, as it felt more robust than traditional, as there's a bit more of a darker chocolate theme with a contrasting palm fruit brightness and a bit more of that candied sweetness. It's nice, but I definitely preferred the V60 on this one. So on day 37, we went back to the V60 with our standard recipe, and it was one of the better days of this coffee yet again, as it's very intense with a heavy focus on the listed tea aspects, as there's a little bit of depth in the nutty, spiced, traditional sense as well. Plenty of the robust, traditional caramel and chocolate qualities with a surprisingly high lingering palm fruit brightness. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have one level 5, so let's go through that one real quick, and that is the finish level 5. That is a very interesting part about this coffee, and going into making this tasting wheel, I said, okay, I can probably fill out the top. A lot of these things are a level 4, but when I went to make the finish, I said, this is just so lingering, and I'm feeling the extent of this coffee for a prolonged period of time that I actually have to put this one at a level 5. And it comes in a very unique sense. So I don't know how you say the name of the tea note that they have listed on here. Is it Roboy, Robah, whatever it is? But I don't really know what that tastes like. I've mentioned in the past, I'm not the biggest tea enthusiast, so I kind of had to look it up, and they said it has like a little bit of a woody, earthy sort of tone to it. And I'm like, well, that explains that tea note listed on here and why this coffee continues to turn out so traditional. Basically, when it comes to a lot of these more, we'll say, traditional origins, something like a Nicaraguan coffee, an El Salvadorian coffee, you have this expectation for them. And when they're presented in a lighter profile, they have a very, we'll say, different feel in terms of the fruit profile, and it gives it a very contrasting aspect to the much more traditional qualities of this one. But those traditional qualities are still present within the coffee, as was evident with this one, and they're presented in a lingering sense. And that's what made for a very interesting experience with this one, because it did have a lot of those qualities, even with this one being slightly lighter profiled in general. So that's where the level 5 comes into play. It's a little bit of that more traditional, we'll say, dark chocolate, caramel, slightly spiced, slightly nutty tone to this one. We'll go to the level 4s. We'll actually start on the other side of the tasting room with the savoriness level 4. I did mention those tea qualities to it, and they are presented in that slightly more nutty, slightly more, let's say, savory tea-like sense. So that's why that one's scoring as high as it is at that level 4 mark, which isn't something that we see too often for lighter profiled coffees, but that's the case with this one. Body level 4, and once again, that's that traditionality of the origin at play once again, as it's very high. Not too many coffees that we score at that level as well, given the type of coffees that we do review. So very heavy, very robust in terms of the body in general. Cleanliness level 4, don't have a single thing to take away from the overall clarity of this one. If anything, it's actually pretty well defined in the notes that they do have listed on here, so I definitely see that being there at that level 4 mark. Sweetness level 4, first thing I took away from this coffee was just how much of a sweetness there was within this one, as I continue to mention that it just feels like it has that darker chocolate and kind of contrasting minty feel to it, which was presented at the forefront, and then that interesting, we'll say, tea-like depth to it as well. So level 4, where we opted to put that. Acidity level 4, and I continue to mention the fact that this coffee did turn out pretty bright, and actually as I was holding up that bag, I noticed that they do say vibrant on their bag, so I think that's what they're actually going for with their profiles. But interestingly enough, a lot of brightness to it, and a lot of that palm fruit brightness, so I think they might have something like a candied pear note listed on here, which I can certainly see goes in line with the sweetness as well as the brightness, as this one surprisingly bright overall. Citrus fruit level 4, and that's what I just mentioned, that kind of more candied pear brightness to this one, is that's the best place to put it in terms of the fruit profile, so level 4 is where we went for that. And then we have a handful of level 3s. Before we get to those, I'll briefly mention the florality level 2. Once again, very surprising when we don't have too many coffees that score minimum level 3. I wanted to highlight and notate that, given that this coffee, once again, much more on the traditional side of things in terms of that aspect. Spice level 3, and that's the kind of peppermint-like quality that they have on here. Candy cane, very interesting. Can certainly see that. This one certainly had a more holiday-like feel to this coffee. Berry fruit level 3, I could see a fair bit of darker berry aspects to it, thinking a little bit more grape. I didn't notate that in any of the notes, but as I'm drinking this coffee, I certainly remembered that being a prominent quality in terms of the fruit profile to it. Chocolate level 3, mentioned darker chocolate feel. I feel like since this one was presented in a lighter profile, that one didn't skew as high as it could have. I feel like if there was maybe a little bit more development to this coffee, you're certainly seeing that take a hold as the most dominant aspect of this coffee. Caramel level 3 has a really nice candied sweetness to it, so that definitely added to the overall experience of this coffee. But outside of that, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I jokingly said to Airworks when I gave him a sample of this coffee that this was my favorite Nicaraguan coffee that we've had this year, and it's because it's the only Nicaraguan coffee that we've actually reviewed this year as far as I can remember. It's just so difficult these days to find really notable and prominent coffee roasters that are carrying Nicaraguan coffees. So any opportunity I get to review one is one that I will happily take, especially when it comes from a coffee roaster that I'm already interested in. So I really like this coffee for it being a Nicaraguan coffee. I feel the same when it comes to profiles like Guatemalan coffees, Mexican coffees, Nicaraguan coffees in this case. When they are presented in a lighter sense, I feel like they offer a very interesting feel to them, and that's why some of them in the past have been some of my more enjoyed coffees in general. This one, it's not going to be one of my favorite coffees from the entirety of the year, but as far as Nicaraguan coffees go, I do have to say that it definitely turned out notably better than I might have expected. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. It's got a very fun mix of traditionality and modernness to it, and that's what I've continued to highlight and focus on this coffee. If you look at that tasting wheel, we don't have a lot of coffees that turn out that way. Much more robust with plenty of the chocolate, nutty, caramel, heavier bodied characteristics to it, while still offering a little bit of that more modern feel with the brightness of the fruit scents and a little bit more of a candied component and a unique mintiness that just gives this one a very unique feel in general. So that's the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Fincas Mierisch wash processed Nicaragua from Swerl Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.